food rights. Food, R-I-G-H-T-S. We have food rights as a subset of an adequate standard of living, right? They're not necessarily interchangeable. It's not a biconditional. But an adequate standard of living is a larger set, which contains food rights as a subset of it. Specifically, I wanted to give you reference to, as I always do, reference to secondary information, primary information, so that you can, if you're researching this topic, just gain more information on the topic on your own. But Article 25 of the Universal Declaration, UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, quote, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, etc., etc., and so on," right? But what we see there is that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of him and herself, including food. So there is an objective basis to this, right? There is, I erased it, but there is an objective basis to this, right? There is a basis in which we can say that, objectively speaking, we're talking about the sustenance of human life. The subjective element, though, is that there isn't a fixed, if you want to put it in terms of variables, there isn't a fixed variable, there isn't a fixed sort of quantity, allocation of adequate food that will meet the demands of every single human being, obviously based on body weight and height and gender and many other factors. We all know this. Body mass index, necessary caloric intake varies between individuals. This is just, sort of intro to nutrition. Some people are going to require more nutrition, more nourishment in order to sustain their lives than other people. And insofar as we're talking about this, that's exactly what this is referencing, right? Is that we need to make sure that for each individual there is an adequate allotment and accessibility to food needed to sustain their lives. Number 4, just a bit of background: the 1996 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the I'm not going to say all that again, the ICE-SCR, right? It says the following, right? Quote, "In no case may a people be deprived of its means to subsistence," right? There cannot be, and later in a bit, like maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, I'll get to sort of Stalin's violation of this notion, right? Obviously this is well after. But the violation of the idea that individuals have a right to subsistence, right? And insofar as we're talking about this right, again, as we've seen throughout the lecture series, there is a corresponding obligation. Primarily in the discussion of rights, that obligation typically has fallen on the obligation for the government to not represent, but to respect the rights of those individuals. So what we'll do is we'll see how we coordinate, if you will, the obligation that the government has and, quote, the right to subsistence, right? So we're going to see what this right to subsistence, right, what this right to subsistence entails as far as the responsibility. World Food Program, WFP, World Food Program. Again, this is just sort of material for you to use to further sort of reference your own research. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this, but what I do want to do is sort of give a very generalized, sort of large scale assessment of the various aspects of human rights in terms of food as a human right, and then I'll get a little bit more strategic in a few minutes. So, food security analysis is used to assess a number of factors related to food security, including the following 3 points. First, the most food insecure people, right? So we need first, the World Food Program says, we need first to identify the most food insecure people. the most, emphasis, food insecure. Right? We have to identify the most food insecure people. And it's not just an identification of the people. I mean, that's obviously the first step. And as I was preparing for the lecture, I was determining whether I would go into sort of explicit detail on this process, and I decided not to because it's just too much information. But just to give you a general idea, sum it up really quickly, it's not simply that you have to make an identification of the people. You have to obviously identify the geographic region in which this food security, insecurity occurs. And then we need to figure out why they're, within this specific region, why their food insecurity is as prevalent as it is. Is it a consequence of over-harvesting? Is it a consequence of a failure to properly rotate crops? Is it overgrazing? Is it desertification? Is it so on and so on and so on and so on? There's any number of factors. Is it because of resource conflicts with another tribe or ethnic group, and so on? Right. So there's many, many different reasons that you would find food insecurities within and among a particular people. The question is not so much who are they, but what are the conditions that led to their food insecurities. And it's balancing and addressing both of those facets that will allow us to secure food for those people. And again, it's not sort of the idea that I bring you a fish. It's like this sort of cliche adage, right? Bring a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, he can eat for his lifetime. It's not so much that we've identified the conditions that have led to food insecurity in your particular region, and here's some food. That really doesn't allow the people to attain this level of subsistence, right? That creates a sense of dependence. And that's the antithesis, right? We want populations to be subsistent and have the ability to self-determination rather. But insofar as we do that, the conflict is an identification of the problem, a recognition of the right to self-determination within the group, and sort of a very complex balancing act after that. So that's the first point. The second point pertains to biophysical threats to food and such, right? So biophysical, right? Biological threats, physical threats to food. Is it a particular insect? Is it a particular worm? Is it a particular pesticide? Is it, as I said before, desertification, overgrazing, what have you, fill in the blank. Failure to rotate crops properly. Lastly, food consumption patterns. Food consumption patterns and on, right? So the point is that a lot of time and a lot of, this is very, very, very tiny portion, and I can tell with respect to the research that I was doing in preparation for the lecture series, that a lot of time isn't really focused on food as a human right. It's not a sensational topic to discuss. It's not like slave trafficking. It's not like torture. Right? It doesn't have the sort of interest that piques the world community, but it is a huge threat. I would go so far as saying that food is a human right, and food security is probably, and I completely agree with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon that it is one of the 3 biggest threats to humanity in the 21st century. It's that significant of a threat. The whole point of me doing this series is for you to get the information out there, just to remind you that this is a threat. This is something that we should really take into consideration, especially now that we're a global economy and we're quickly approaching global society, global culture, and so on, right? With respect to consumption patterns, biophysical threats, and food insecurity, this is paramount, right? Identifying the weaknesses and the causes for food insecurities within particular geographies can give us a huge opportunity to intervene on those who can't, for whatever reasons, fend for themselves. All right, so that's the first part. And then just a quick note: the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, 1966, ICE-SCR, Article 11.